When we started, we thought it was more teacher knowledge, right? It was better professional development. So here's what's known now. Deborah Ball, the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Michigan and a heroine in the math education community, justly so, did a beautiful study in which she identified what teachers needed to know to teach mathematics. And she and Brian Rowan, one of the great organizational behavior methodologists, studied the effects of teacher knowledge on student performance. A full standard deviation difference in teachers' knowledge of mathematics for teaching produces 1/25th of a standard deviation difference in student achievement. Virtually meaningless. The message is that there's something about our schools that make it hard for teachers to use harder knowledge to benefit their children. If you just work on teacher education and make more sophisticated teachers, you're not going to find big effects in schools. It means that we have to be in schools and work more comprehensively in them. Laura Hamilton and Brian Stecker's study of how teachers make sense of accountability and standards. It's a beautiful study. They interviewed thousands of teachers in 3 states, California, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. I don't know if they were supposed to say that, but those were the states. And they asked, what's the effect of all this accountability on teachers? And it turns out that teachers really do respond, but they respond as quirky ways as individuals. Some teach to the test, some teach more content. And they asked, when you look at these reactions, where do they differ? Are they within a school, across schools, or across districts? 97% of the pooled variance is at the school level. All this rhetoric about teachers as principal leadership, systemic reform, the superintendent as instructional leader, they could find no trace at all of any of it, despite Harvard's education school, PELP, and all of that. Zero trace of it on the ground in schools. This is really complex because it means that teachers are filtering and interpreting things through their own lenses, but of course it means we have to get much better at communicating coherence in schools. So simple theories that university folks had, namely us when we went in, the key is social coherence and relational trust. Very famous studies that show that unless schools have certain capacity, when you push on them, they get worse rather than stronger. Right? Beautiful study of Linda Skurla and Roger Goddard showed that a full standard deviation difference in relational trust and collective efficacy produced 1/10 of a standard deviation difference in student achievement. Why? Because schools at the bottom are incredibly coherent. In many urban districts, there are schools where kids have no advocates and teachers that no one else wants to work with. And those folks really stick together as a team. Right above them, we have schools with 50% teacher turnover every year. So professional development strategies make no difference in student achievement because the teachers you work with this year aren't there the next year. So if we're really going to climb in and work with schools, we need to be much more sophisticated about what the nature of schooling actually is. We have to have much more textured and complex understanding of what's on the ground. And our instinct is to try to work at the place that matters most, what happens between teachers and students in classrooms. If you just work on that, you'll never be able to get scale. So these are unsolved problems here, but places are making enormous differences. And I just want to end by showing you some of the work we're doing in response to challenges that are worthy of our best attention. So our university has adopted 60 districts, and we've worked collaboratively with teachers, researchers, product engineers, designers to create a new set of tools that are every day present in teachers' lives. And the idea is to figure out what it would take to actually raise the evidence standard of what we do in schools at every grain size. For every individual task that we ask students to work on, how do we actually know it's the best task? Can we say with what probability, if students can do this task, they can actually do the next task? Right. So we have built, with product designers, as a public service to Texas universities, an online support system for teachers that actually helps them teach the topics that they feel are the hardest to teach. And I want to just show you a little inkling of this because it represents a very different way of universities working with schools. So what was the hardest problem that our teachers said they actually faced? This was a big surprise to us because we thought that teachers would say it's students' prior academic background because that's what university faculty say about high schools. And it turned out that that was not it. The number one problem that algebra teachers in our district identified, exactly reflecting what the President's Math Panel report found, was student motivation and engagement. In the President's Math Panel, 62% of algebra teachers said that student engagement was problem number one that they faced. Our students don't persist. They give up immediately. They don't think they can do the work. So we put together a group of scientists at the university and from other universities, groups of teachers, and we said, how can we help schools, not with what we think is the number one problem, but what they think is the number one problem. And here was what was hardest for the university folks and for me. As a mathematician, I like to create new worlds. I love imagining new worlds and figuring out if they're possible. As soon as we actually started working with schools on things they would pay for rather than funded by external grants, the discussions took a completely different turn because it had to be stuff they cared about enough to support. And it turned out that they have all kinds of commitments they've made as districts. They've bought certain software. They've invested in certain programs. They can't imagine a new world. They need to work in the world as they live in it. And the trick for us was to come up with a kind of structural engineering that respected what was actually on the ground and the structures that were in place. This was extraordinarily hard for university people to deal with. And it required spending much, much more time in schools to understand the garden that people were actually walking in. So if the technology works, I will show you, and being a teacher, I can always improvise. So, yes. Is this going to work? Yes. Usually I depend on my young students to help me with this stuff. Let's see. Yeah. Persistence. Okay, so here's an example of a new form of working, and it's the latest toy we're building on. Teachers said that they needed a way of inspiring kids to persist and to shape what it felt like, to teach kids what it felt like to be a successful learner in school. We convened our experts, and we discovered painfully that our psychological experts all spoke in their own language and strongly disagreed with the other experts we brought in. We had people who believed in Bandura's theory of mastery and vicarious experiences. We had people who believed in Carol Dweck's verse of goal setting, malleability of intelligence. And it took weeks of teachers being the arbiter of which ideas spoke to them as professionals. We lost about half the university researchers because they weren't willing to let teachers be the arbiters, right, of which ideas they wanted to try in classroom.